Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition cost. One can also audit such a course at a much less cost. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. Today's lecture is a part of our 10th annual Kościuszko Chair Spring Symposium in honor of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel. This event is sponsored by the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies and the Center for Intermarium Studies. This evening, we will be hearing from Miss Maria Juczewska. Ms. Juczewska is a communication specialist with versatile international experience. Her education in linguistics, cultural studies, and international affairs, combined with years of living abroad, makes her point of view unique and comprehensive. Ms. Juczewska has worked for the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies since 2014. In her scholarly work, she is especially interested in propaganda. Ms. Juczewska, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you at the Kościuszko Chair Symposium this year in a bit changed format to talk about the wartime fate of the Polish children deported to USSR in 1940 and 1941. The title of my presentation is Damned or Delivered, and I will elaborate on the complicated fates of Polish orphans in the USSR and their subsequent travels around the Middle East and in fact all over the world. The reason Kościuszko Chair is elaborating more on the fates of Polish deportees is the fact that this year, in 2020, we are commemorating the 80th anniversary of the massive deportations of Poles to the far eastern parts of the USSR, which took place in the 1940 and 1941. So to very briefly sketch the historical situation, to set the context for the fate of Polish deportees, on September 1, 1939, Poland was attacked by Nazi Germany, and subsequently on September 17, it was also attacked by the Soviet Union, and Polish lands were partitioned. As a result, in line with the earlier decisions of the secret at the time pact Ribbentrop-Molotov, the lands of Poland and USSR, the lands of former Poland, of the interwar Poland, were swallowed, so to say, by Third Reich and Soviet Russia. To a certain extent, the fates of the Poles in both zones were similar. They faced far-reaching persecution and deportation. However, in the case of the Soviet-occupied zone, there was a semblance of legality of changes. The Soviets introduced gradual replacement of old institutions and structures, and they also organized a plebiscite on October 22, 1939, by means of which the Poles inhabiting those parts of Poland declared that they want their respective regions to become the parts of Western Ukraine and Western Belorussia. Poles who hesitated how to vote were instructed through private channels by the former Polish authorities that it's better to vote in line with what the Soviets wanted, because the Polish government didn't want to endanger Polish populace. Kind of social revolution was organized in eastern Poland with local support of ethnic minorities, and a part of that policy of complete remodeling of the Polish of the former Polish territory and the former Polish society were massive deportations of Polish citizens, especially the members of the Polish elites, all the people who were involved in some way with business, intellectual activities, teaching, state administration, as well as social activists. An important aspect of deportations to Siberia is related to Katyn Forest Massacre, which used to be a major event in terms of what the Poles could suffer through during the Second World War. Namely, at the very beginning of war, when the Polish territory was annexed into the Soviet Union, Polish officers were arrested by NKVD and they disappeared. Their fate was known until more or less March-April 1940, because their families were receiving letters from their husbands and sons and fathers, and the soldiers arrested were not only the active service soldiers, they were also reserve soldiers. So it was not only the young men who were taken away. However, at some point the trace disappeared, families stopped receiving letters, and the fate of those officers was one of the main problems of the Polish government in exile. So in the deportations of April 1940, in the deportations of February 1940, the families of those officers were already being transported to the east, in line with the plans that the Soviets had for the officers. Namely, in April and May 1940, they were summarily executed, and this massacre of the Polish POWs has been a bone of contention throughout the Second World War in Poland's relation with USSR. It was a complicated relationship because Poland was the ally of Great Britain and France, and when Hitler attacked Soviet Russia and Soviet Russia joined the anti-Nazi alliance, the relationship between Poland and Russia remained fragile, mainly because Poles were determined to find out what happened to the missing officers. With time, it transpired that they're dead and that they have been murdered, and whether this was done by the Nazis or by the Soviets was the main problem in Poland's international relations throughout the Second World War. Meanwhile, because the Soviets already had plans with regards to the Polish men, something had to be done with their families. So, deportations took place in 4 waves: on February 10, 1940, on April 13, 1940, on the night of 28 to 29th June 1940, and in May, June 1941. The first deportation was especially terrible because it was because the winter that year was particularly harsh, and people were transported to the far east of the USSR in very bad conditions. They were taken away in the middle of the night. They were given half an hour to pack, and more often than not, they were not informed what is going to happen to them. So not many of them didn't have warm clothing and all the necessary items for a long journey, and what they packed and how they were treated throughout the procedure of packing depended on the personal choices of those who came to arrested them, which, as may be inferred from numerous accounts that were left by people who participated in those events, were much more interested in looting of the apartments of the people arrested than in informing them what awaits them. So this is how the tragic odyssey of Polish elites began in the 1940. The first deportation composed, of course, the people arrested were the people mostly left behind by men who were going to war. So the percentage of women and children among the people arrested and deported was high. In the first wave, it was 40%. In the second wave, it was as many as 80% of women and children. Just to say a little bit about the controversy on the number of deported, according to the railway and KVD records that were revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian estimation of the number of people deported is around 340,000 people. However, the estimations conducted by the Polish government in exile in line with the map that you can see here were much higher, maybe as much as 4 times more people were deported. And probably it's safe to assume that the number of people deported was at around the level of 1,200,000. But the task of counting of the victims is still there. We still need to try to be more precise about the number of people who were deported. This map shows where all those people found themselves. So here to the left of the screen, you can see the territory of the former Poland. The red part is the part that was incorporated and partly incorporated and partly occupied by the Third Reich. In stripes, gray and red, you can see the parts that were incorporated as parts of Soviet Union to the Soviet Union. And this red arrow shows us the direction of deportation, and the red circles show us the main locations for the deportations of Poles, and the diameter of the circle corresponds to the number of people deported. So the larger the number of people deported, the larger the circle. And as you can see, most people ended up either in the south of USSR or north in the north, close to the Arctic Circle. So as you may imagine, the problems that Polish refugees came across were terrible, because they were faced with numerous adversities related to climate, to their general unpreparedness for the harsh conditions of life, also due to the fact that they were not informed about what kind of equipment they need, what kind of clothing, whether they need to take medicines or not. So they ended up in terrible conditions. Most of the times they were just dropped in the middle of nowhere and relocated to some punitive or not punitive villages in the depths of the USSR, where they were in fact sentenced to slave labor, starvation, and desperate living conditions because there was no other choice anyway. So depending on the location, there were difficulties related to temperatures which were either extremely low or extremely high, or whose amplitude was extreme, like very cold nights and very warm days in the south of the USSR. They were working in dehumanized conditions. They didn't have tools and clothing appropriate for this type of work, like hard work in the woods or hard work in the field. They were punished for being late or insufficient in terms of work quotas, which was frequent given the fact that those were mostly women and kids who were working, or I would say teenagers, because kids up to the age of 12 were not allowed to work and had to go to a school instead, or a kindergarten, or if their age fell in between childhood and puberty, they would do some minor preparatory work. Also, the people who supervised them were cheating when filling the worksheets to not give the appropriate amount of food or money if there was some money given for the work. Excuse me. One of the most terrible rules that the Polish refugees faced was who doesn't work doesn't eat, and this meant that if the food was given only to the people working in the family. So if you were a mother of 4 and your children happened to be tiny and happened to survive the terrible ordeal of getting from Poland in a cattle car to the depths of the USSR, a journey which often lasted 3 or 4 weeks, then all you had to eat was what you can earn with your own labor. So obviously food was insufficient. People in many memoirs remember eating anything that was edible or non-edible just to keep themselves going in spite of disgust, supplementing it with whatever the local environment could provide. And in this regard, the people who were deported to the southern parts were maybe a little bit more lucky because they could find something in better natural conditions. However, people who were working in the forest, they could supplement their food at least in the warmer months. As a result of general malnutrition, overwork, and desperate hygienic conditions of life, the disease was rampant, and the survival rate was not high. So further developments in the war, namely the attack of Hitler on the USSR, came as a salvation to Poles who were left stranded in what grew to be called inhuman land, because the recollections from the USSR of Polish deportees were so terrible that the name Inhuman Land, which is a title of one of the books about this experience, was generally applied to the overall experience of Poles in the USSR in that time. In those photographs, you can see the Polish orphans in the USSR, especially the picture in the left bottom corner shows the desperate improvisation conditions, but we will talk about it more now. So, as a result of the attack of Hitler on USSR, the Polish Soviet diplomatic relations, which were severed as a result of the attack of USSR in Poland, were reinstated, and as a result of the Sikorski-Majski Agreement in July 1941, the two things happened. A decision was taken to create Polish armed forces in the USSR, composed of the people of Polish citizenship who found themselves in the area of USSR by any means. So whether they have been deported or whether they have been arrested and incarcerated, they could now become members of the Polish armed forces in USSR. So they were free to join the forces who were in the process of being created. This occurrance of and Polish civilians who were heretofore had been the deportees and were sentenced to forced labor were free to go to join the Polish forces. Of course, it was not an easy task. Many Poles were not informed about the amnesty or were in some sort intimidated by the people who supervised a given settlement, because naturally the leaders or managers of such settlements, they were not happy to get rid of slave labor, so they were trying to intimidate the Poles to not move and just keep working. But nevertheless, many Polish people decided to try their luck in joining the Polish armed forces in the USSR. So gradually, to the concentration points of the Polish army, which were in the south of the USSR, more and more people started coming, proving to the horror of the Polish government in exile that all that had been suspected about the conditions for the Polish people in the USSR was actually true, because they were severely undernourished and oftentimes in very bad physical condition due to frostbite and hard labor. So what transpired immediately was that before those people are able to serve in any army, they need to be at least a little fed and cured from the most urgent physical conditions. This whole process of the concentration of the Polish armed forces in the USSR was taking a little, and with time it became obvious that the appearance of a large of a large army that has political allegiance independent from the USSR is not very welcome by the Russians, in spite of the provisions of the Sikorski-Majski Treaty and them being allies and the Poles being allies. So more and more problems were being made to the Polish forces. So General Sikorski, who was the commandant of the army and who had previously been imprisoned himself in Łubianka prison, decided that this army, at whatever stage of readiness it is, needs to be evacuated from the Soviet Union, lest the Soviets try to stop them by incorporating them into the Red Army or dispatching them to some front of the very burning need, that is the German-Russian front. So the decision was taken to evacuate the forces, and they were evacuated between March and September 1942. And as a result of this evacuation, more than 100,000 people left the territory of the USSR, and this included 36,000 women and children, for whom leaving with the Anders army was really a chance of survival. There was one caveat: only a family of the military person could leave. So not everybody was allowed to leave. General Anders was doing all he could to take as many civilians as possible. So additional units for teenagers were created next to the regular units of the Polish army. They admitted children between 14 and 18 years of age, and the aim of those units was preparing people for later military service, and it became a pretext of evacuating people younger than 18 from the territory of the USSR, even if they were orphans, so couldn't be considered a son or a daughter of a military man. And of course, Polish authorities were quite lenient, so if you are 12 and could still claim you look like 14, they would accept your claim that you're 14. The decision to evacuate Polish orphans was a separate decision of Stalin, which was taken on December 24, 1941. So the efforts in this regard could officially proceed. This was an operation in itself, because Polish forces in the USSR, they were very happy to welcome whatever children tried to join them, and in the memoirs you can read that that the Poles would sometimes travel for tens of kilometers just to meet the military unit and hand over the children to them, deciding to part in this way and hoping that at least the child has the chance of survival. So this whole epopee of Poles in the USSR is the event full of drama and suffering, and only when you read the memoirs of people does it become obvious how taxing all those experiences were. So with regards to the roads of evacuation, there were two routes. One through the Caspian Sea from the port of Krasnovodsk, today in Turkmenistan, to Pahlavi, today in Iran. There was also an alternative route on which we will focus, which led through the mountains on the Russo-Iranian border, from Ashgabat through Kopetag Mountains to Mashhad. So we already saw this map, but because the distribution of the Poles in the USSR, of the deported Poles in USSR was such, it was decided to move the sites of concentration of these future soldiers farther and farther south, southwest, to be able to be stationed as close to the point of exit, or the anticipated exit, as possible, and naturally as close to the theater of military activity too. So what you can see here is the route that became known as the route of hope for many people that had been deported or arrested and sent to prisons in the Gulag archipelago. Here in the dark red, you can see the arrows that show how far all the all the deportees were taken, and the yellow arrows show the initial place of the concentration of the Polish armed forces in the USSR in Buzuluk, and its travels to Tashkent, then from Tashkent to Krasnovodsk, and through the Caspian Sea to Pahlavi in Iran. And as I already mentioned, the Polish orphans and Polish children in general joined General Anders' army. But the moment there was an official permission for the evacuation of the Polish orphans, some of the deportees who joined the General Army's units undertook the efforts to organize Polish orphanages along the route of the march of the General Anders' army, and they also undertook systematic search of Polish orphans, not only in the locations to which Poles were deported, but also in various orphanages, Russian orphanages, the so-called dietdoms, or dietdome, or basically in the street, because many children that were orphaned, or many children that got lost during the travels with their families, could be found. This was especially true in the conditions in which Poles in the USSR were free to move around the USSR, trying to join the Polish armed units. So many people were on the move. Of course, this process was somehow supervised by the Soviets, and their movements were also restricted. Oftentimes, they were redirected in incorrect directions, or instead of being freed, they were just sent from one place of forced labor to another. So it definitely was not easy to find General Anders' army, and even if you managed to do that, it wasn't at all obvious that you would be taken. So of course the epopee of the General Anders' army is a topic that deserves a series of lectures at least. So let's just focus on the orphans. So this activity of Polish civilians, volunteers, working together with the Polish armed forces was undertaken. Children were, they fished for children, so to say, and children were coming to the concentration points on their own as well. And in the end, the place of the final preparation of children for transportation elsewhere, outside of the Soviet Union, became Ashgabat. And the tragic fates of children and the ordeal of children can be found in numerous memoirs. Naturally, those memoirs are published mostly in Polish, but documents in English can be found too, as well as documentary films. So I encourage everyone to look for documentary films online. One of the especially poignant reports on the topic is a book entitled I'm sorry, because it's called Tułacze dzieci, which could be easily translated into either wandering children or exiled children. My take on this title is exiled much rather than wandering, because wandering implies some sort of voluntariness of movement. Meanwhile, the Polish deported children had really no choice. So the author of this book is a famous Polish singer, cabaret performer, and actress, Hanka Ordonówna, who had been deported herself, worked in horrible conditions until she was able to free herself. As a result, she suffered from tuberculosis, which got renewed in the conditions in which she had been working. But in spite of her own personal ailment, she was very active in those search units which were searching for Polish orphans, and she belonged to the first group of people who left with the Polish orphans for Iran and later for India. So this is how she describes the arrival of children collected in smaller concentration points by other activists of the same civil service earlier, and who were in the end summarily sent in one train to Ashgabat. So this is how she describes the situation she witnessed. Into this Ashgabat night there spilled from the trains a crowd of little paupers from whom everything had been taken away, including their parents' loving hearts, encased in the bodies frozen under the faraway snows. A station lamp dangled in the gusts of wind, projecting shades and lights onto exhausted, emaciated faces of children. This tragic lot formed a long procession. The children barely dragged their legs in pairs, misery with disease, hunger with lice, to the awaiting buses. So this gives us the idea of what it looked like. The faces of children, the one that you see in the top, in more or less in the middle of the screen, is the child that was received in the collection point in Vrejskoye, close to Tashkent. As you can see, the malnutrition is obvious, just as in the case of the other child beneath. The condition of children who started to appear in the Polish orphanages all over the USSR is described by the excerpt from the letter of Ambassador Stanisław Kot from Kuibyshev, where temporarily Polish embassy was established after the diplomatic relationships were reinstated, to the Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski to London, to the government in exile. The present state of hygiene and food supplies in the Soviet Union, coupled with the extreme exhaustion of the children, makes taking them abroad the only possible way of saving them. I therefore request that the government look into this issue as soon as possible and take at least 50,000 children out of the Soviet Union, quartering them in British territories in Asia and Africa. I stress that this is the only possible way of saving these children, who will otherwise be condemned to death and thus be lost to Poland forever. And here you can see the pictures of the Polish orphans and children who reached, who were evacuated to Iran. Both of the pictures to the left and the one in the middle were taken in Iran. Meanwhile, the photograph in the right bottom corner has also a special history behind it, because the boy in the middle, the one signed with a black cross on his chest, is holding his sister, and this is the sister whom he saved by bringing her on his back to the orphanage, in spite of the fact that he was 6 and she was 1 year and a half. So because his mother died and there was nobody who could take him to Samarkand, where he heard that Poles are concentrating and that there is a place for children too. He was walking in the snow with his sister, who was below 2 years old, and when she could no longer walk, he just found some piece of cloth and he made a bundle and brought her on his own back. So this is the type of situation Polish children were facing before being evacuated. After they were evacuated to Iran, some of them were transported farther, some of them stayed in Tehran, and some traveled farther to Isfahan, which became for a while the city of Polish children, and this is how it is still known to the Iranians when they discuss history of the Second World War. Where you can see a cross on the map is a place where a Polish cemetery can be found as well, and a Polish Jewish cemetery, that is the cemetery of the Jews that were Polish citizens as well, because many of those who survived evacuation didn't live to enjoy freedom. So this is the, here you can see the route of General Anders' army, whose formation started here, and then they traveled subsequently to Tashkent, and then through Krasnovodsk to Pahlavi, and then farther on to fight on all the fronts of the Second World War. However, we are going to focus on this part of the trip on this smaller route, which is the route that Polish orphans took from Ashgabat. And this is how the efforts of General Anders to save as many Polish children as possible when evacuating the military and the military meet the efforts from another country, namely from India. In parallel to the efforts of General Anders' army inside of the USSR, there were efforts of the Polish diplomatic mission in India. The ambassador Eugeniusz Banasiński and his wife Kira, who was a Polish Red Cross member, to organize a relief mission to the Poles in the USSR. So initially they were not thinking about the evacuation of children. Initially they just wanted to organize a mission that would send material support to the deportees in the USSR, undoubtedly alarmed by the news that were spread due to the fact that the Poles were allowed to correspond with their family members, and this is how the news about their terrible conditions could be achieved and disseminated. An important contribution to the whole endeavor was made by Dr. Tadeusz Lisiecki, who was Polish vice consul in Mumbai, at that point Bombay, and who became the manager of the whole mission. Also, another person who is going to reappear in our story was Father Antoni Kluta, whom you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, next to the Ambassador Banasiński and Mrs. Ambassador Banasiński. And while to the left you can see Dr. Lisiecki. And what was very particular about this Polish Red Cross mission was that the road that they were meant to take was a land road, as opposed to the sea route, which was usually used for the transportation of cargo and goods. They decided to try to deliver goods to Ashgabat through the mountains. So both the Soviet authorities and the Indian authorities were very skeptical about this route. It was dangerous. It has never been tried before, and it was all in all a risky mission, even if only cargo was considered, not to even think about Polish undernourished orphans. But because the arrival of this mission coincided with the appearance of the Polish orphans in Ashgabat, and a new idea was raised to try to transport whatever children there were already back to India, to not lose the precious time in which diplomatic relations that were worse and worse every day between Polish government in exile and the USSR are still good enough to allow people some field for maneuver. And this the mission ended with success, which is proved by the document that I'm presenting to you. This is a report of the Consul General of the Republic of Poland to the government in exile, in which he says that the leadership of the expedition was able to successfully struggle against all the odds which they encountered both in Soviet Russia, like the fight against the typhoid in the orphanage in Ashgabat, in which no child was dead, as well as different occurrences in Mashhad already on the Iranian side. The expedition succeeded in transporting children to Bombay in generally good health condition. I also need to emphasize that organizing a land transport in convoy between Bombay and Quetta, Mashhad, and Mashhad to the Soviet border into the Soviet territory was the first time achievement and an exploit with regards to the cargo transportation on this route. I believe this is a success because both the Indian central powers and the carrier companies were very skeptical towards this idea and didn't believe it could succeed. I also must emphasize here that the biggest success of all is to organize the convoy transporting people that has not been achieved before, which faced additional difficulties such as lack of room and board facilities en route, and the necessity to put the children to sleep in the trucks and in garages, and also face the difficulty in terms of providing them with food. I must say that without the goodwill and the organizational abilities of the head of the strip, that is Dr. Lisiecki, this wouldn't be possible. So it shows us how the resourcefulness of the Polish diplomatic mission, both the ambassador and both the consul general and the vice consul, ended in a spontaneous, so to say, but very risky mission of saving Polish orphans, which is, I think personally, a topic worth filming. So this is what this convoy looked like in Iran already. The transports through the land route took place 3 times. The transportation of children in this way. Altogether, approximately 600 children were transported in 3 escapades, so to say. But the difficulties of this route were such that the vice consul discouraged the Anders' army from taking the land route of evacuation and definitely recommended the sea route through the Caspian Sea. So this other route allowed for the evacuation of children as well. The conditions of the evacuation, you can see crowded ships, which in themselves were not in a very good condition. This is in what condition the children were transported. You can see them lying exhausted on board. And in the bottom left corner, you can see the mission that is accepting the refugees. You can see the sea in the background and the tents on the beach. And those tents on the beach where people were disinfected and given opportunity to wash themselves and to get some new clothing, resurface in many memoirs. So those were memorable moments for those people who are leaving USSR behind, together with all the difficulties and dangers that living there posited for them. So this is the reality of this trip. This is the reality of living conditions. And this is the political reality. And here I will have to switch from one document to another. So I just need a moment of patience on your part. Just a second.
Out of the land of Poland, there came a band of refugees. A nomadic company now arrived at the Transcaucasian foothills after an exodus that started 4 years ago. The fragment of a migration which has wended its laborious way through Russia to Persia. You see here a typical family caught up in the pathetic tide. Their name is Kowalski, a family of 6. Father, mother, grown-up son and daughter, and 2 small children. They have managed to escape the separation which has broken so many thousands of other families. The Kowalskis are symbolic of the spirit which no dictator can prise loose from a nation. For 4 years, these emigres from tyranny have stuck together. During their wanderings, mothers have given birth to children on a bed of salvage. Those precious bundles they cling to, containing objects of a family's worship, and held on to because they're made beautiful by memory. Journey's end, the promised land, the reward of infinite suffering as the band of pilgrims arrives at its destination, to be overwhelmed by their countryfolk already living on Persian soil. To intrude upon this scene of paradise is to witness the frantic search for relatives, the strength of feeling which, as loved ones are found, sweeps this refugee camp like a forest fire and consumes everything in a blaze of unfettered emotion. To this temporary home near the Caspian Sea came Pathé cameraman Terry Ashwood. From the frontier to this home for the homeless, he had followed their journey. Now, within the enclosure, he sees establishment officers registering the newcomers. The victims of Poland's agony find a haven of rest in Persia. British and American Red Cross associations supply them with new clothing. Small wonder if these suffering people had given up hope of ever finding happiness again. See how already the Kowalski family are reacting to their good fortune. A first simple act of kindness has acted like refreshing rain to a thirsting flower. What elation comes from a new frock, a clean shirt, and shoes for men and women who have walked barefooted for hundreds of miles. The Kowalski family stride out in the grounds of their new home. Only those who have known hardship and privation can experience real happiness. They know now where their next meal is coming from. Here is food, shelter, and a brotherhood which, having stood the test of suffering, is nobler than all the riches in the world. In this Iranian amphitheater, the community of Polish refugees sing and dance once more. No opera house or theater has known such happiness in an audience. Entertainment is not sold here. It's as free as the air in which it's given. You're looking at a family which has lost everything but its soul. They find their wealth now in something far greater and lasting than material things, stripped bare of their worldly belongings, yet rich in the spiritual blessings which no power on earth can bring to those who hate them. For this enriching of the spirit, the Kowalskis give thanks to God. By this act of devotion, this congregation exposes the shabby world in which we live. The humble and meek shall be exalted. To the canvas city comes the camp commandant. Able-bodied men and women are given the opportunity to retrieve their homes. The Kowalskis talk it over. The Poles know where their duty lies. Their minds are soon made up. They're not people to hide behind the efforts of others. Father, son, and daughter are going out to carry on the fight.
As we could see on this propaganda film, the truth about the real conditions of life in the USSR of Polish deportees was not revealed. You could see people with clean faces, clothing in a relatively good condition, no malnutrition, no lice in their hair, no dirt, no exhaustion, nothing. The information about the true nature of the relationship between Polish citizens and the USSR authorities in the territory of the Soviet Union was withheld. The reason for it was very simple. The Soviet Union was a powerful ally of the coalition fighting the Germans, and whatever could disturb the peace of mind of the nations that participated in that coalition had to be censored. As a result, the problem of Polish orphans was not a problem that could be widely publicized, and the terrible condition of children, their malnutrition, exhaustion, emaciation, starvation, was not to be talked about. And this is the political reality that we are facing. The civilians are evacuated, but what to do with them is a completely different story. The people who joined Anders' army, the soldiers, they will recuperate and they will march on, and they will become the fiercest anti-German soldiers in Europe. However, the civilians will have to somehow manage. And one of the countries that extended the helpful hand was India. Not only because of the activities of the Polish diplomatic corps in India, which through the organization of the Polish Red Cross mission initiated some action before politicians were ready for this action, but also because of the goodwill of Indian politicians. And although the situation, politically speaking, was difficult for India, because it was involved with British politics by virtue of the relationship between Great Britain and India, but at the same time there was a lot of internal tension inside India already, a lot of movements calling for the independence of India. Poverty was widespread, and the vision that Polish deportees are supposed to, that the Polish evacuated deportees are to make sojourn in India was not such a joyful prospect to the authorities of India. However, there were other factors that came into play, which I'm going to discuss further on. For now, we are here in Mashhad, to which Polish orphans were transported through the mountains, and they still need to go along a dangerous mountainous terrain through Quetta into the place which is going to become their final destination, which is going to be Balachadi. And it is all happening as a result of the goodwill of Maharaja, which is known in Poland as the Good Maharaja, Divijay Singhi, who himself is an Indian politician who is cooperating with the London government and even participates in the seating of the British War Cabinet. He himself knows Polish culture a little bit through his meeting with Ignacy Paderewski, a famous Polish pianist and a politician, which took place in his youth. He is very sympathetic to the Polish culture. So when he hears about the desperate situation of the Polish orphans evacuated by the Polish Red Cross, by the mission of the Polish Red Cross organized by the Polish consulate in Bombay, he is very much willing to help. So he offers to host 500 Polish orphans in his duchy, and he later declares to be ready to host another 500 when such need arises. But on top of that, he also appeals to the other princes of India to create Polish Children Fund, whose aim is to gather money for the support of the Polish children in India, so that it's not a burden on the Indian government and gives some field for maneuver to the Poles. And this fund is active till the end of war, and indeed provides funds. So the good Maharaja has leverage because he is also the head of the council of the Chamber of Princes, which was a political body assembling together the leaders of small dukedoms that were parts of India at the time. So here we can see a number of photographs of good Maharaja, and here in the middle you can see him attending a small play that was put together by the children of the colony for children that he created in his dukedom for Christmas. So what he said about the fate of the Polish children and why he took this momentous decision, which was the first step to allow more Poles into the territory of India, were the following words: "Deeply moved by the suffering of the Polish nation, and especially those Poles whose childhood and youth has been tragically overshadowed by this most terrible war, I wish to somehow contribute to the improvement of their fate. I offered thus to host them in my duchy far away from the torrents of war. Maybe there in the beautiful mountains on the seaside, they will be able to forget about all they had been through and regain their strength to work in the future as citizens of the free country. It is an utmost pleasure for me to have the opportunity to make the life of the Polish children at least partly easier. So moved by his heart, he went to great lengths to make the life of Poles easier, and especially of the Polish orphans. So those Polish orphans saved from the USSR, assembled in the Polish orphanage in Ashgabat, which subsequently got evacuated, will find their home on the Indian soil in Balachadi near Yamnagar, in the province of what is now Gujarat. The first children arrive on the April 16, 1942, and you can see them here in the camp. The large photograph shows how it was organized. This is the large square in which they would assemble for all the important events. Here we have all the children in characteristic headpieces called topi. And through that camp, in the end, went almost 1,000 children, not only the around 6,500 evacuated from the USSR by land, but also children who came to India by other means. This is a camp for children, so they are mostly orphans or half orphans, aged between 2 to 15. And the camp is organized in such a way as to provide them not only with a place to stay, but also with means to grow as human beings. So there is a preschool, a school, hospital, church, kitchen, laundry room, so they can lead their regular daily life, but also be educated. And with time, excellent educational offer develops, although initially there is shortage of books, manuals, and teaching staff. With time, it is all taken care of, and more qualified staff from among the Poles evacuated is recruited, and also some of the manuals are printed in Iran and then provided to the Polish children in India. There are also printing houses in another settlement set up for the adult Poles later on. Children engage in schooling, scouting, sports, and extracurricular activities. And the commandant of the camp throughout the whole existence of the camp is Reverend Franciszek Pluta, who is known as a strict but fair leader of the Polish settlement for children. There is also a matter of diplomacy involved, namely due to the initial reluctance of the Indian authorities to open their borders to refugees. Maharaja adopted the children and said they are his family members, so he can do as he pleases, and he is perfectly able to offer them shelter in Balachadi because they are his family members. So in short, whether this was real adoption or whether he just used it as a ruse to be able to host the children, he did treat them as his own children. He wanted the children to address him as Bapu, which means father. he was a frequent guest in the Balachadi camp. Children were allowed to use the sports facilities in his own residence, such as the tennis courts and the beach. And there was a very warm and welcoming relationship between the Maharaja and the children. As a result of this initial step of building, of allowing the access of Polish orphans to India, the British authorities of the Indian office in London finally decided that they will open the borders of India to 5,000 Polish refugees. And in this way, a year later in Valivada near Kolhapur, a Polish village of Valivada was created, and this was a regular Polish settlement in the middle of India, and the longest lasting facility for Polish refugees in India, which was active still in 1948, when the last refugees were leaving it. And it emulated the model which was created in Balachadi. That is, it offers a number of opportunities for personal activity and growth to the people who are amassed there. So it not only assembled people, but also allowed them for having regular daily life, but created also a number of cultural institutions that were available to people and youth who lived in Valivada, because as you can see in Balachadi, you could live up till the age of 15, and then many children were schooled in India, and after they finished schooling, they would return not to Balachadi, but to Valivada. And here we have a number of, so there is a model which makes people involved in the community that they are building, and they are bound to it not only by the way of physical location and accommodation, but also through various cultural activities and religious activity, of course, apart from their ethnic national bond. Also, a number of other camps were created on the Indian soil for the Poles. Bandara and Quetta and Karachi Country Club were transitional camps, so people would only arrive there to be dispatched in other directions. Panchgani was of different nature. It was a mountain resort, and there was a small Polish home created in Panchgani for people endangered with tuberculosis. Those were mostly kids, but also some adults. And one of the first patients was the Polish singer and film star mentioned earlier, Hanka Ordonówna. So in all those places, children would meet with very warm care. All their needs were being met. Education was organized even for those who were in Panchgani, and in theory could be only left to being medicated and treated. But the people who were involved in the organization of the activities for Polish children were really determined to give them not only efficient medical treatment and housing, but also to restore their emotional equilibrium and to give them a semblance of a normal childhood. So you can see the conditions for everyone who stayed in those resorts. Here you have a meal in Bandara for children. Here's the visiting of Karachi. Here's a mass organized on the outskirts of Karachi for Polish Catholics. And here's Penjgani, the home where the tuberculosis patients were treated. And here there is a small aside remark. Karachi Country Club was not a country club by any means. It was only a location in which tents were awaiting the refugees pitched in some desert. So to name it a country club was only an expression of particular sense of humor of the Brits, not really of the conditions that accompanied the refugees. Here we have a plethora of activities that people were involved in, both in Balachadi and in Vali Vade. So you can see the sports, which was an important aspect of bringing up in those times, musical activities, theatrical activities for small kids, scouting, which was especially popular at that era, but also popular because the natural conditions of India encourage, I would say, controlled exploration of nature and provide a lot of sense of excitement to those who explore nature, of course, in supervised conditions, because natural threats in that climate are also present. We can also see in the left bottom corner the religious service in Vali Vade, and to the in the top right corner we can see the weaving class. So children were not only educated in terms of letters and mathematics and classical subjects that you can study at school, but also in terms of various professions. And this whole Indian adventure of the Polish orphans ended after the end of the war. It is another complicated topic which deserves another lecture, but for now I can only say that as a result of the conferences in Tehran and Yalta, Poland didn't emerge from the Second World War in its initial shape. It lost almost half of its territory to the Soviet Union, half of its territory in the east. It also fell into the Soviet sphere of influence, so the conditions of life in Poland changed. And as a result, Polish refugees didn't feel like coming back to Poland after the war. So there was a longer dispute between the former allies, the representatives of the no longer recognized Polish government in exile, the new communist government of Poland, the refugees, the British authorities, and then the United Nations authorities. So there were many people involved in the discussion of how to close the refugee camps and what to do with the refugees. And ultimately, in spite of the pressure of the communist government of Poland on repatriating all the refugees back to Poland, they were left a free choice, and only 20% decided to go back. They were coming back in subsequent waves. The last wave of refugees left Vali Vade, which was the last location to which first people were concentrated and from which later on they were dispatched on the Indian soil. In the left corner you can see the departure of a group of refugees from Vali Vade. In the left bottom corner you can see the ship which transported the Polish refugees, the Polish refugees who decided to go back to Poland. And in the top top right corner, you can see those young Poles who decided to not go back and decided to go to the United Kingdom. So I can say that this experience of Polish orphans in India was important, first of all, because it created the precedent. Due to the entrepreneurial spirit of the Polish diplomatic mission in India, the facts were created at a Polish cross transport, Red Cross, Polish Red Cross transport with humanitarian relief was dispatched, and they had an opportunity to bring the children back, so they used it. And this allowed for the precedent of hosting of Polish refugees from the USSR, and allowed other people who left USSR in this way to not be left in some kind of limbo or, God forbid, be sent back, but to be located in other locations as well. And those locations were in the Middle East, in Eastern, in East Africa, but also in places as far away as Mexico and New Zealand. So in certain terms, the evacuation and placement of the Polish refugees from the USSR became one of the major civilian logistic operations of the Second World War. Other locations in which Polish children found themselves were African countries of Kenya. Of course, the names come from those times, so by now those countries no longer are named this way. But at that point it was Kenya, Tanganyika, South and North Rhodesia, the Union of South Africa. In the Middle East, Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine, and additionally Mexico and New Zealand. And in terms of catering to children's needs, it all followed the same pattern: a settlement for children, sometimes children alone and sometimes children accompanied by adults, was created. And in the Poles themselves self-organized, and they were also supported by the Polish government in exile, to create as soon as possible educational network, provide educational opportunities, and provide also vocational training, so as to not lose time of the children, because Polish authorities were acutely aware that the years that they spent in the Soviet Union were the lost years in terms of their education. And I think that what is especially laudable is this focus on providing the youngest and the most vulnerable citizens of your country with the future, in spite of the war raging around, and in spite of increasing doubts whether Poland is going to exist in its former political shape. There is still this vivid concern for the future of the youngest representatives of Polish nation, which I think is a formidable focus, especially when you read the stories of the African settlements, in which conditions were particularly primitive, and still there are schools built and education is resumed, as education and cultural activities like dramas, dancing, scouting, sports are resumed as soon as it is only possible. There is a curious story related to the settlements in Mexico and New Zealand, namely the creation of the settlement for Polish orphans in Mexico created, so to say, inspired the creation of the same settlement in New Zealand, because the children traveling to Mexico by ship stopped over in New Zealand, and thus inspired the wife of the Polish consul in New Zealand to start efforts to have a similar settlement in New Zealand. And Countess Juczewska spoke to Mrs. Fraser, the wife of the New Zealand's prime minister at the time, that this would be a great idea. And this is how those two ladies set off to work and created opportunity for Polish orphans to stay in New Zealand in the camp in Payatwa. And this group of orphans ultimately became New Zealanders. Only very few people came back to Poland from that group, and they were well organized, and the children and the youth assembled in that camp put together a small ruse. One of their friends who decided to go back to Poland, because many of those who decided to go back to Poland were coming back only because their family members were in Poland and they wanted to join their families. One of those friends was supposed to write back to them a letter, and since they expected censorship, she was supposed to write in a pen if conditions were good, and in a pencil if conditions were bad. So when she came back to Poland after a while, a letter in pencil came, and this was a factor which decided about many of those who were her friends staying in New Zealand. What I believe is a formidable odyssey of the Polish nation, which survives not only deportations in terrible conditions, but also dispersion, and still manages to recreate the structures of their society abroad, is also a story of very touching kindness of multiple individuals who encountered the tragedy of the orphans, of the Polish orphans from the USSR, and opened their hearts to them. And through singular acts of kindness, like the act of kindness of Polish Consul General in India and Vice Consul, as well as the Consul in New Zealand and his wife, other people are put in motion, and the initiatives which end up hosting hundreds of children are put together in place. So the pattern of organization was the same for all the locations that hosted Polish orphans, and the doubts that they had upon leaving were the same, whether they should go back to Poland, whether they shouldn't, what awaits them in Poland, which is no longer the Poland they know, was a paramount concern. And most of them decided against going back. So the ones that lived in Africa, they usually traveled farther on to the United Kingdom and sometimes to the United States. While the ones that were in the camp in Mexico, they opted for the United States, which was greatly facilitated by American Polonia, of course. The ones who lived in New Zealand seamlessly integrated with New Zealand society. And this leads me to my conclusion. This is the commemorative plaque of the children of Balachady camp, which was installed there at the end of the previous century. which basically expresses the gratitude of all the children that were hosted there for the open hearts of people who wanted to have them as their kids for a while. And the plaque says, hail to the hail to the faraway land, to the friendly land, to the human land, to the good land. So the children of Baba Chadi remembered for decades about the kindness that they experienced in India after the horrible experiences of the deportation to the USSR. Also, this whole epopee and the story of their complicated life allows us to ask another question, whether the experiences of Polish refugees of that time can be applied to modern times, when we witness mass emigration in many parts of the world. It seems that the model that the Poles proposed, where the locations in which refugees are become not only the places of accommodation and provision, but also the places in which some organized life is taking place, together with all its aspects like education, vocational training, culture, religious practice, and other activities, is not a good model. It looks like the people who, it seems that the people who went through those refugee camps in their youth, even after the very traumatic experience of being deported to the USSR, were able to achieve in their adult life. Many of them gained higher education. Many of them were able to tackle the challenges of emigration head on. Those who came back to Poland were able to survive in a system which was quite difficult to survive in. So obviously, a regular experience of such a refugee camp with an organized structure has proved in the past to give good results. Of course, not all the methods from the past can be applied, because we no longer are very fond of scouting, or we no longer take religion as seriously as people used to in those times. However, it seems that a refugee camp which provides some perspective and some opportunities for the future and a vision of the future worked very well for the Polish populace. So maybe this is a model we could resort to in the future too. Thank you for listening to my lecture, and I'm very glad that you followed us on this epopee of the Polish orphans. Let's not forget about them. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'd like to thank Ms. Maria Juczewska and all of you who tuned in. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that's iwp.edu. Thank you.